All right, so what's up, YouTube? Welcome to episode 3 of the Unity podcast. Today I have Mike Shore. So we used to be roommates, and he's a philosophy major. We've had a lot of interesting discussions, and he's got a pretty interesting past with meditation. And so I want to open that up a bit and kind of talk about, how does he interpret meditation and what it does for him, and kind of some of his experiences. And then also, we've had a lot of interesting conversations about psychedelic use. And so I want to kind of ask him about experiences with that, and then I think this is kind of in the broad theme of something like spirituality, maybe consciousness. It's like something beyond just the scientific way of kind of coming to understand the world. And yeah, so welcome, Mike. I guess to start, yeah. So to start, I'm thinking we could start with meditation. If you want to just kind of give us maybe a background on like your history with meditation and how it all started, and then be good also if you could talk about some of these retreats that you go on, for long periods of time and you're silent. And yeah, so you can take it away with that.
Yeah, so I'll give like the very brief version, and you can let me know if you want me to go into any more detail. But basically, 7 years ago, I did my first meditation retreat, which was precipitated by psychedelic use. So I know we're going to talk about that in a bit, but I got into meditation about 7 years ago. I went straight into the deep end because I had a really strong intuition that there's a there, like there was something that really called to me in meditation. I just had this feeling that there's something to be explored there. So I went right into the deep end. I did
Do you
a
know?
10
Do you know how to understand that calling? Like, how do you interpret the call to meditation? You know where that came from, or kind of what that felt like?
I think part of it definitely came from psychedelics,
Okay.
which is, having experiences of consciousness that are very different from ordinary
Sure.
waking consciousness, and being shown without any, no room for doubt that there are different ways of experiencing the world. So I
Sure.
think once I was opened up to that, and then heard that meditation has some things in common with psychedelics, that was a lot of what made me really interested.
Okay.
But I think there was also something, that's harder to explain, something more intuitive that just said, there's something here that's worth exploring. Like,
Sure. Sure.
yeah. So I went right into it. I did my first 10-day retreat. That was really, really powerful, really eye-opening. And again, like, I was already sold beforehand, but after that first retreat, I was completely sold. And I've been going pretty hard at it ever since.
You want to maybe
So I've done,
describe like what the retreat is like? Because like you've told me a little bit, and it's it's pretty intense, and I don't know if
yeah,
people
so,
typically know what a retreat is.
right. So the form of meditation retreats that I do they're in the Buddhist tradition,
Okay.
particularly insight meditation. So it's a specific type of meditation that's all about paying close attention to your moment to moment experience. You're not trying to change anything. You're not trying to like build concentration necessarily. You're just trying to be very aware of what's happening in your consciousness moment to moment. So that's
Okay.
the form of meditation that I practice. And these retreats are basically boot camps for that. So you go in, you put away your phone, you're in complete silence, and you spend 16 hours a day essentially doing meditation, what I just described. You get your food, and you get your room, and you get everything taken care of, and then the entire time there is dedicated to just building up this capacity. And retreats can range from as short as 3 days to all the way up to people spend years on retreat. The longest retreat that I've personally done was 10 weeks, about
Wow.
2 years ago. So
And there's a
uh,
requirement to stay silent, right? Like there's going to be other people on the retreat with you, and like there's like a rule to not interact with each other at all. Is that true?
yeah, so again, it varies, but most meditation retreats that I've done have been silent meditation retreats, which means that you're not supposed to talk to people unless you like really, really need to for some reason, but essentially no talking. They
Okay.
even encourage you not to kind of non-verbally communicate, so you're not really supposed to make eye contact or be very communicative. It's kind of people sticking to their own lane. Because
Okay.
the idea is to facilitate a space that is very conducive to building up this awareness of what's happening in your own experience. And social interaction really pulls us out of that,
Sure.
especially in the earlier stage of practice. So The silence is actually really supportive
Okay.
for building continuity, for becoming more aware.
Okay.
So yeah, that's basically it. I go on retreats now. I'm in school, so the nice thing is I have a lot of break time, and I basically, for the last few years, I've been dedicating basically all of my breaks to going on these retreats. So
Hmm. Yeah, I
this summer,
remember. Like living with you.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this summer, for example, in a month, I'm going to be going on a 3-month retreat,
Oh wow.
which is going to
Okay.
be my longest silent retreat.
Okay.
I was just a few months ago, I was on a retreat for a month. And there's this place on the East Coast in particular that I really like practicing at. So that's where I go. And yeah, that's basically it. In
And then,
terms of, yeah.
how much does it cost?
Um,
Is it expensive? Like, is it? Yeah, like, is there something that's like, a vacation, or is it, you know?
right. So, again, there's a spectrum when it comes to that,
Sure.
but generally speaking, it's pretty expensive if you're going to pay full price, but most of these places offer scholarships. So
I
it's kind
see.
of like
I
no
see.
no
Okay.
question no question asked scholarships, where if you need financial assistance, if you want to go and you can't afford the full price, they'll really help you out.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Nice.
so again, there are also places that are fully donation based, and there are places that don't offer scholarships. So like there's a lot of variation,
Okay.
but a lot of the Buddhist places that I go, like generosity is a core value in Buddhism.
Okay.
So they really try to make it as accessible as they can.
All right.
For
Great.
example,
Great.
like the
Yeah.
teachers on these retreats don't get paid. Um,
Oh, really?
so you're paying only to get, like, you're paying for the facilities and for the staff and everything, but the teachers, the people who are actually teaching you how to meditate, they don't get paid. Instead, it's donation based with them.
I
So
see. Okay.
they get only what students kind of offer them at the end of the retreats,
Hmm.
which I really love. I've always found that to be like a really beautiful model. It's like
Yeah. No.
pay,
Sure.
pay it
Sure.
forward. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Sure. No. I definitely agree with that. And then, all right. So I think one thing I'm definitely curious about is, you clearly seem to get something out of this, because as long as I've known you, you've gone on multiple of these retreats. So it wasn't just like, okay, I want to really experience that. I tried it, and then I'm glad I did it, but like, that isn't for me. Like, there's something about the retreat that is bringing you back to it. You view it definitely a value, and so you know I've never been on such a retreat, and I imagine my audience, it's probably not a super common thing. So I guess, what is it about the retreat that you find so useful and valuable?
Yeah. That's it's a big question. I think the
Sure.
best way to talk about it is just to describe what meditation is about, the type of meditation that I do, because retreat really is just a way of doing meditation more intensively. So
Sure.
it's not that retreat is a completely separate category. Retreat is like boot camp for this thing that I try to have be part of my life as much as I can outside of retreats, right?
Sure.
So retreats aren't an end in and of themselves. They're like a way to go deeper and then hopefully, ideally, bring that back out and carry that into the world.
Sure.
So with that being said, the type of meditation that I do is all about, again, it's called insight meditation. And that's because the ultimate goal is to see more clearly what it's like to be you in every given moment. And in particular, and this again, this goes right into the deep end. It can sound a little esoteric, but the idea is that we don't have a self in the way that we feel like we do.
I remember we
And
talked about this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so this type of meditation is basically a tool designed to make you realize that in your own experience. So rather than take that on as an idea or some sort of belief,
Mhm.
the promise is sit down, pay attention to what it's like to be you, and you will eventually see that we don't have this core identity that we feel like we do moment to moment.
Okay,
And
this might be.
that's a can of worms in and of itself, but
Yeah, I mean,
that's
so
kind of like, yeah.
I mean, if you're up for it, I think it'd be a can of worms that would be interesting to explore, because I know we briefly talked about this. We've had some interesting conversations about it, and I would say that I have resistance to this idea. And what's it called again? It's like a certain type of thing, like
Um,
Dzogchen or something like this.
Well, Dzogchen is a form of meditation that's like particularly focused on this, but
Okay.
all of Buddhism, like any flavor of Buddhism that you will encounter,
Mhm.
has at its core this idea. It's just they'll
Okay.
talk about it in different ways. But it's like essential to Buddhism is this notion of no, they call it no self, which is like we don't have an enduring self in the way that we feel that we do. And by the way, one more piece that I should just add, which is really important,
Mhm.
is that the reason this matters is not just for pure intellectual curiosity. The idea is that a lot, or some people would argue, all of our suffering comes from this feeling of self. So seeing through it is not just a game. It actually leads, again, according to this model, leads to the vast reduction or maybe even the end of suffering. So the goal in Buddhism is less slash no suffering. The way to
Mhm.
get to the goal is to see through this notion of the self. That's kind of the
Okay, is it possible to define the self, what you mean in this sense? Because like I have a conscious experience of a particular point of view and lens that I see through. And so in some sense I would say that is myself. But then to say that you don't have a self, and I remember we talked about this briefly. It was kind of like, okay, if I had two iPhones next to each other and imagine one was consciously me and then there's an exact duplicate, it's like there's no difference between one cell phone and the other cell phone. And that's kind of like the idea with me. There's something like uniquely and special to me that defines me as self. Is that kind of the idea, or?
yeah. So right. So the notion of self that the Buddhists are like questioning is not that there aren't separate selves. Like obviously you are there and I'm here and we're like separate bodies. Like that's not
Sure,
what's in question.
sure.
What is being questioned is this feeling that I am behind my eyes, kind of appropriating my experience. Like I'm in my head,
Mhm.
kind of riding around in my body as though it was a vehicle, right? And and that my thoughts are somehow owned by this me, right? I'm thinking, I'm doing, I'm making decisions. That's the intuitive sense that we have
Mm.
moving through the world is there is this little me inside that is like in charge, that is doing things, that is separate from the rest of the world. That is a very powerful intuitive experience that I think most people have most of the time. And that's what's being called into question. And again, the
Okay, that's interesting.
what's being
Yeah.
proposed is
Okay.
that can be seen through. Like you can see that that is not actually accurate. It's because it only is born of distraction. Like the only reason we feel that way is because we're not aware enough. And if we were more aware, we would see that that's not actually how things are playing out moment to moment.
I see. This is interesting, yeah, because like the thing that brought me kind of to spirituality and say religion or something is actually this idea that you're describing. Is the idea that it's kind of like I'm actually not in control of my actions, and so there's something beyond what I am saying is me. Like the part of me that I identify with that tries to control my will and tries to force me to do particular things is completely ineffective, and that there's something else that's beyond the part of me that I identify with that actually kind of guides virtually all my actions. Uh, I guess I haven't made the leap to say all because I still feel like in some sense there's something, but that at least the control that I have is minimal. And then the recognition of that made me say like, okay, well, what is controlling me in some sense? And I think at least phenomenologically, I think it's okay to describe that in some sense as spirit. And like that's kind of how you could maybe lean into some of the more traditional Abrahamic religions, let's say. And then yeah, so is this kind of like what you're saying? Is that like part of you that you at least identify with? So I think in psychology, right? Like I don't know if you're familiar with Jungian psychology or Freud, and there's this notion of the ego, and then the ego initially is defined as something like the part of you that you identify with. And then there's the unconscious, which is by definition the part that you're unaware of. And then is it kind of like something like the ego is the thing that causes suffering, and to recognize that the ego isn't, I guess, yeah, it's hard to make this leap because also if you take the Jungian model, like the self he defines as the totality of everything. And then it's kind of like the goal in Jungian psychology is to find the self. But then I have a feeling that what is called self in the Jungian model is different than what you call self. So I don't know if this is like ringing a bell at all to what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that to your point earlier about spirit, yeah, but I mean this is where um I think it's important to distinguish between like the Buddhist model and what other religious traditions say, because
Sure.
it's actually a very core distinction
Hmm.
where the Buddhists aren't saying there is no self, but there's some sort of big capital S self that is like in charge of everything slash God. Like there is someone who's in control of this whole show. They're just saying there's nothing there. It's just all a process that's unfolding organically. There's no central intelligence. There's no, first mover. There's none of that. Whereas a lot of other religious traditions talk about a god or spirit or that kind of thing, which implies some other locus of control, right? It's not us, but there's something else out there that's kind of doing the work. And that's a very fundamental difference in terms of the kind of metaphysical picture. Um,
Okay,
I
fair enough.
personally,
Fair enough. Sure.
yeah, I personally think the Buddhist model is more um, more accurate and more intellectually honest, because I think it's not introducing pieces to the puzzle that aren't actually warranted, right? They're saying it's purely phenomenological. They're saying if you sit down
Hmm.
and spend enough time observing your own experience, you will see these things for yourself. They're not making necessarily metaphysical claims about what that means, about how the world is structured. All they're saying is that your experience can reveal facets that are usually overlooked. Um, and
Yeah.
I should say,
Good. Yep.
the Buddhist tradition has grown into like there's views about rebirth and there's views about all these like different cosmological domains, like so there's a lot of baggage there, but
Okay.
at the core, like if you really kind of pare it down to like the most fundamental ideas, it's really just about phenomenology. It's about our experience. It's a like a, I've heard it referred to as like a um yeah, like a first person science of the mind, right? Like that's what it is.
Sure.
It's just about what it's like to be you. It's not about like how the world is structured or what is or isn't out there.
Yes, it's interesting because I would say I'm currently trying to think about how exactly to say this, because I wouldn't say necessarily that I am a Christian, but it's like I'm most aligned with Christianity, let's say. But then I I treat Christianity as a phenomenology. Like I treat like there are experiences you have, and that if you say that there is a God, if you say that there are angels and spirits and demons, whatever, it gives you actually predictive power, like or let's say explanatory power. And so then, but at its core, I do view it phenomenologically. But then, so I guess now in the Buddhist worldview, or at least in this worldview that you're describing, what is it that decides your actions? Like, is it consistent with a form of materialism?
Yes,
Yes,
it's actually
interesting. Okay,
it's
interesting.
very compatible. It's actually more compatible than a lot of people realize, because Buddhism has a very strong notion of cause and effect. That's a big part of Buddhism. They have this idea of karma, where like
Mm,
things have a very
sure,
lawful nature to them, where certain actions have certain effects. So, um, and again, karma can get kind of wooey if you really go down the rabbit hole. But fundamentally, what's at the bottom of the idea of karma is cause and effect. Like there are causes that lead to effects that lead to more causes that lead to more effects. That's the whole chain. That's the whole picture. So that's
sure,
very compatible with like the scientific
sure,
outlook, which
sure,
is like
sure.
we just have processes in place that are influencing one another, and that's the whole game. Like that's the whole show.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually don't even necessarily disagree with that, but I do have a strong resistance to materialism as like a complete valid worldview. And what I'd say is like, at least from an explanatory perspective, I don't see how the materialist worldview can actually explain why you do what you do and why you value things. Like I don't know how it can actually, like, essentially I guess it's like the big question of how do you get an ought from an is. And I yeah, and in some sense it's like a religious structure provides some model to explain that. But then is there a notion of oughts in Buddhism, or I guess yeah, maybe can you explain that a bit? Like I guess what is it that, because that's the part that I feel like materialism fails to be able to provide, but there is an answer because we don't act randomly. So there is a thing, there's something that decides the actions that we take, and there's something that decides what we value. But then I don't think, at least from my perspective, that materialism can actually answer such a question, but the question has an answer because it's not random. And so then, to me, that's where you kind of like need religion in some sense, or something like religion, to explain this like landscape of value.
Yeah, I mean, so two things on that. The first is that I actually agree that I think materialism has some questions to answer for, but not the ones that you're actually highlighting. I think
Interesting.
that
Okay.
primarily the reason that materialism falls short of fully explaining what's going on is consciousness. Like
Sure. Fair enough.
this is always overlooked, right?
Yeah.
Our experience, the fact that there is something to be like us in any given moment, the fact that the lights are on,
Sure.
is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the greatest mysteries that we can encounter.
Sure.
And materialism has nothing to say about that.
Sure.
We haven't made any progress in terms of explaining how it is that matter becomes aware, right? We can
Sure.
correlate brain states with conscious states. We're getting better and better at that. But even if we had like the perfect map of what brain states correlate to what conscious states, we will have said nothing about how it is or why brain states are conscious to begin with, right? So I think there's a massive gap there.
Sure.
But in terms of what you're saying, I actually don't think that's a problem for materialism, because we might be mistaken about whether or not we can ground our ethical intuitions without something like a spirit or God, right? We might be wrong about that, but that doesn't give you a God, right? That's the problem. It's
No, fair enough.
It's like, an invalid. You can't go from the fact that you want to ground your morality in something objective to then concluding that therefore God exists, right?
It depends how you
Like
define
that's,
God.
That's working backwards.
Yeah. Depends how you define God, because I would say, like, okay, like let's say the typical notion of God as some external conscious agent, some supernatural being. I agree with you, fair enough. But then, in some sense, I almost define, once you have a set of oughts, and you ask, okay, I have a moral obligation to align with a certain set of, principles, then I would say the articulation of the greatest good is, in some sense, God. And to act in alignment with those is to worship God. It's something like this. But then, like, that doesn't necessarily make it an external conscious agent. It's a phenomenological idea, because then you can form a relationship with the highest principles, and you can, ask, like, okay, is this, am I doing the right thing? And then an answer will come up, and so it's like phenomenologically you get a lot of the same machinery of like a monotheistic religion, but you don't metaphysically need to have an external conscious agent.
Right. But I guess, like, I don't see why a materialist couldn't account for all of that without introducing this God idea, right? Because a materialist can just say that what values are just brain states, right? When you value something, it's just your brain firing in a particular pattern, right? That's what it is. There's nothing more going on there. So I don't see how it's a problem for materialism to account for why we value certain things. We might be wrong about what we value, but I think materialists can tell a story about what's going on there that leads us to value certain things and others.
I think it's the same thing with consciousness. It can maybe provide a map between inputs and outputs, but it can't explain the map. It can't explain the origin of the map, right? And so, like, in science, it's like, like, it's a big thing with machine learning. So it's kind of like, machine learning provides, potentially a perfect map between inputs and outputs, but it doesn't explain the origin of the map. So, like, in science, it's like, we want to reduce things to a set of principles. We want to say, like, F equals ma, or some laws of physics, and then from that derive the equations. But if you just had the equation, like, I feel like it's the same thing with consciousness. Like, if I could come up with a model that can map inputs to outputs, that, like, essentially what that means to me is that there is an explanation that can perfectly explain it, but the map itself, I don't think actually, like, to me, it's not at least intellectually satisfying. Like, the explanation of the map is what I care about, and I don't see how you can totally get that purely from a material worldview, because I don't think the world of ought is contained in the material world. Like, if I look at a chair, there's no ought about the chair. And I think it's a byproduct of consciousness, and it's a byproduct of the fact that we suffer, and that we should maybe minimize suffering, or, something like this. Like, there's something like value, I think value and consciousness are kind of like intimately related, but maybe they're not. Like I don't know. I mean, if someone convinced me that materialism can explain this, then I would change my mind. But I just don't see how you can actually ground that in a material world and look at just, just you're made up of atoms, and therefore, you shouldn't steal because, it'll like cause suffering to someone. Uh, yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like a big question that I'm trying to piece together. And my belief is that materialism is incomplete, and that something is needed to be tacked on top of materialism to explain such questions.
Yeah, I think I feel that there's like two questions being confused here. Like there's one question as to like how a materialist can explain in materialist terms why it is that we actually value things and not others. I think that a materialist can have very good answers to that question. What I think you're speaking to is something separate, which is how is it that a materialist can ground their oughts or their ethical intuitions in something objective without introducing some sort of something additional like a god or spirit or something. And I think that is a very difficult question, but do you see how those questions are separate? The first question is just, can a materialist explain kind of like descriptively why it is that how it is that human beings arrive at value judgments? I think a materialist has no problem explaining that. You're asking, I think, something more philosophical, which is, how is it that, like, what can we ground our value judgments in on a purely materialistic worldview? And I think that is a genuinely difficult question that a lot of materialists have tried to grapple with, and I too haven't seen a fully satisfactory answer to that. But I do think it's distinct from the first question.
I actually don't see the difference. What's the difference between the two, in your point of view? So one is like to be able to explain how we come to make value decisions.
Right. The first question is just, how can a materialist describe or explain the process through which we arrive at ethical judgments, right? And I think a materialist can give a full picture of that. They'll talk about brain processes, and they'll talk about psychology, and they'll talk about culture and a lot of other influences that end up resulting in the fact that we do move through the world thinking that certain things are good and certain things are bad. I don't think there's anything left out.
But then why do we value things as good and bad? Is that the second question? Because it sounds like the first question, what you can say is that there are things that guide us, and there are things that like we view as good and bad, but then does it tell you how to generate what is good and what is bad?
Right. So again, that's the second question.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But in terms of like, why is it that we value things as good and bad? You can tell a very plausible evolutionary story about why we would evolve that mechanism, right? Like, there are good reasons for why organisms would evolve this map that involves things you want to navigate towards and things you want to navigate away from. I think there are very good explanations for that. What I think you're asking is something, again, more philosophical, which is, given that we have this structure, right? We have this psychology that orients us towards the good versus the bad. How are we supposed to figure out what to place in each of those categories without, like, on a purely materialistic worldview? And I think that is definitely that's certainly a project, right? It's difficult. And
sure.
I think that is what motivates a lot of religious people. They'll say exactly that, which they'll say, I don't get how you can get morality without God, so therefore I believe in God.
Yeah, like, it's not even God to me. Like, it doesn't have to be God. It depends how you define God. It's just some new set of axioms outside. Like, you have to take, there's a set of presuppositions in the materialist worldview, and those suppositions alone, I don't think can generate morality. But so you need an additional set of axioms, maybe it's one axiom, that then can generate morality, and then whatever that is, I just call that the class of religion. Like, it's the things that essentially address religious worldviews. But like, I would call Buddhism a religion, even though Buddhism doesn't necessarily have a god, right? So it's like not the god part that's important to me. It's a set of unfalsifiable presuppositions that define some kind of, framework to generate what is good and what is bad. And that set of axioms is different than the set of axioms that defines materialism. I think that's more how I would frame it. And then I would call whatever that set of axioms is that set of axioms the empty set, meaning materialism can explain it? Then I would say materialist worldview is correct, or it's complete. If additional axioms are needed, I'm essentially defining that as religion. And this is maybe an abusive use of the word religion, because I think, religion comes with a lot of baggage that people typically think of. So it's a bit abusive, but that's kind of what I mean by that, I would say.
Right. I mean, I think I feel like we got a little sidetracked.
No, sure.
But I just one last comment on that is, again, I think that fundamentally the issue with this kind of move is that you may be right, or it may be true that it's much easier to ground something like morality in a religious framework, but that doesn't mean that that's therefore the correct way to go, right? Like the fact that framework X works better for our objective Y doesn't mean that framework X is correct, right?
I agree.
Yeah, so I think that's always what rubs me the wrong way with this kind of this kind of argument, which is we like our morality, we want to ground our morality, religion gives us a way to ground our morality, therefore religion is true.
Oh, I would never say that. Right. Yeah, I would never say that.
Right.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my intuition is that no currently formed religion is the correct answer. But then that you need something beyond materialism. But all right, so I mean that was related to this meditation idea of self, and I don't know. I mean, this is kind of one of the questions I'm after, so I don't think it's a total diversion. But all right, so then I think there's a better idea of an absence of self. I think, is it in the psychological term? Are you saying that the ego is not you? When I say self in psychology, when I think of self in the Jungian model, it's kind of like your psyche is split up into ego, unconscious, and then the unconscious. He really goes deep into the unconscious. Talks about different things called archetypes, and then it's kind of like the self is the totality of all of that. And so I think that definition of self is not the same definition of self here. And so, is that true? Because that almost is obviously exists, but then I'm still a little tricky on your definition of self to say, at least in this framework, that such a conception of self doesn't exist.
Yeah, and that's totally fair, because I feel like it's something that's somewhat tricky to talk about.
Sure.
But I should say that this Buddhist idea of no self is compatible with a lot of these psychological theories of self. They're not at odds with one another. The only difference is that the Buddhist will say that all of those theories are mapping out the structure of our psychology, right? They're talking about the different ways our psyches are structured, and the way our minds, our different parts interact with one another, and all of that can be super useful and valid. Mm-hmm. But the piece that the Buddhist adds is that none of that is fundamentally who you are, right? It's not what you are essentially. Another way of getting at this is to point out the fact that most of us identify with certain parts of our experience and not with others. That is to say that most of us don't feel like we're beating our own hearts, right? It's just something that is kind of there and it's happening. But on the other hand, our thoughts, for example, are something we strongly identify with. Most of the thoughts that we think, we feel like I am thinking. This is me. This is not something that's happening to me. This is something that I am doing, right? And the same goes with choices. When you're making a choice, usually you feel like you are making that choice. You are in the driver's seat, navigating through the world. And it's that feeling that meditation is kind of takes as its target to say, is that actually true? And the thesis is that no, all of it is just happening in consciousness. There's nothing in consciousness that is more you than anything else that's in consciousness. It's all just objects of consciousness that arise and pass away, and it's just a stream that's, kind of unfolding. I don't know if that
Okay,
made any
no,
sense.
that
Yeah.
actually does. I don't actually. Okay, I don't think that's actually really like I don't disagree with any of that. So yeah, but I would say that I do have a self. But then I don't disagree with anything you said. But hmm, yeah, that's tricky. Like it's almost like this is kind of a like religious idea with because like a lot of people will criticize Christians for basically giving credit to God always, and they're like devaluing personal action. And it's like if something good happens, that's God, and if something bad happens, that's I don't know. Maybe they call it God, maybe they call it something else or Satan. Who knows? But yeah, like it seems like to okay. Do you feel like, or at least in this framework, does this framework feel like essentially you have no agency? Is that the idea? Like free will is a myth. That
Yeah.
is that like an equivalent way to say this? That
Yes.
essentially there are other processes beyond your conscious will that essentially are what dictate the actions that you actually take. And in some sense, all you are is a spectator to your life. And it's almost like okay, interesting. So it's almost like like metaphysically, it's like you are placed in this body to be a camera and to view conscious experience, but not to manipulate it in any way. Like there's nothing that you can do as the observer to actually change or interact or engage with the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That gets right at it. And I think this is an
Mm,
important
mm,
an important point to make, though, which
mm.
is that can be that can be seen in very different ways, right? Someone might hear that and think that that sounds incredibly depressing and disheartening, and what's the point if that's what's going on? But the experience of discovering this is profoundly liberating. It's
I can
freedom.
see that, yeah,
And
because you're not going to be attached to anything because it's kind of like it's like watching a movie now. It's like I like if something bad happens, it's well, it didn't happen like oh that's tricky. I can smell why if you experience that and accept that would alleviate suffering. It's like hard to fully articulate, but I can kind of see it now that
yeah,
is
I was on one of my meditation retreats a few years ago. I This analogy came to mind, like, organically, that I think really captures this. And it is like, imagine you're driving in a car
mhm,
and you're super stressed. You're like sitting up front and you got your hands on the wheel and you're like, "Grr."
okay,
And then for some reason you're like, all right, let me try something. And you lean back a little bit and you kind of relax a little more and you see that you're good, like nothing's really happening. So you take one hand off of the steering wheel and you're still driving, and then it's like, oh, still good. And then you take another hand off and you're kind of just letting the car steer on its own, but you still have your legs on the pedals.
mhm.
And then you take one leg off the pedal and another, and then you totally recline. And essentially you end up realizing through this gradual process that you were never driving the car to begin with. You thought that you were. So there was all this stress around being in control of something that you weren't in control of to begin with. So there's this profound, like, oh, I can actually relax. Like, I don't have to I don't have to do anything because it's already happening. And
Yeah,
that's
okay,
why the ultimate punchline of this is incredibly hopeful. It's not something that is depressing. It's not some sort of like bleak, oh well, you're just destined to just be, thrown around by life and it's all just going to happen to you. That's like a very negative framing on something that is actually fundamentally very beautiful and very freeing. Yeah.
yeah, because I would say in my therapeutic journey, I would say okay, I haven't gone to the full extreme of you have no control, but a big aspect is actually forfeiting control, and to it's kind of like there's this weird thing that I've noticed where it's like okay, I am trying to control something to happen. Like okay, one thing is I kept getting in these relationships that you know were causing me problems. Let's say that I don't want to like say anything too harsh about anyone, but like there was a pattern in the kind of relationship I was getting in, and then so I told myself like okay, I'm gonna go to therapy so that I stop liking this and I stop liking that pattern. And then for a long time in therapy, I was trying to like figure this out, and it was kind of hard. And then I accepted it. I accepted that okay, I just like this kind of relationship, and that's okay. And I'm gonna instead of trying to stop liking that relationship, I'm gonna work I'm going to try to figure out how, given the fact that I like this kind of relationship, to make it functional. And then when I did that, I stopped liking that kind of relationship. And there was this really like strange insight that it was like being attached to the idea of changing it prevented me from actually being able to change it. And it was, I had to accept the fact that I didn't have the control to do this. And then the result was actually that I no longer like had an attachment to that kind of relationship, and just I don't find it actually as engaging anymore. Like it's not something that I find appealing, and I find it like actually kind of boring and not something that I want to pursue, which is really strange. It was like somehow I had to accept the fact that I liked the thing to stop liking the thing. And yeah, but then it was like, I kind of submitted my control to it, and it's kind of strange because I did fight it though. Like I had a control to fight it, and it seemed like alleviating that control caused something. But then would you say that that's just an illusion? Like both cases were almost predestined to happen. Whether I tried to fight it or didn't fight it, it was like that was all just an experience in consciousness, and I didn't actually have any choice one way or the other.
Yeah, I think, well, you can arrive at no free will without Buddhism, right?
Mhm.
Like a lot of Western philosophers have reasoned themselves into the view that we don't actually have free will.
Okay,
The scientific picture doesn't leave a lot of room for the
fair enough.
notion of free will.
Sure.
But certainly Buddhism, the feeling, this notion of no self does imply no free will very strongly. So that is to say, you can arrive at no free will without Buddhism, but if you're Buddhist, you are pretty committed to saying that we don't have free will, which is to say that we don't have this kind of like libertarian freedom to really fundamentally control things in the way that we oftentimes we feel like we do. That being said, though, I think is a really important thing to clarify, which is that it still matters, right? Our decisions still matter. It matters what we do. It matters what we don't do. Like, because again,
Sure.
everything cause and effect, right? It does actually matter if I choose to go to one school or another, or if I say something to someone that's, hurtful. All of those things really matter. The only point is that you weren't fundamentally in control of that, right? It's all unfolding to begin with. But it's not that things, it's not like a nihilistic picture, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not that things don't have any meaning because of that. It just means that you're not driving this car, right? You're
I
not
actually, I
at the
actually
wheel.
don't see how it matters. That
It matters, again, it matters experientially because it introduces very deep levels of freedom that are
no, I mean like choices. Why do
oh,
choices matter if ultimately you don't choose? It's kind of like which school you pick is already predetermined.
right. But what's predetermined is that process of choice that you're going to go through, right? So imagine I have a big decision now, right? I'm thinking about what I should do when I graduate.
Mhm.
My experience of that is going to be going back and forth the way any other person would, right? Which is maybe I should move, maybe I should go here. I want to work as this, I want to do that. I might spend months obsessing about that. But while I'm doing all of that, I can still be fully aware that that entire process is conditioned. Like I'm not creating any of that. That's the decision-making process is happening to me. Does that make sense? So it's like thinking that we don't have free will is fully compatible with making decisions and maybe even agonizing over decisions, because that process is still an important process. It just means that all it is to say is that you're not actually the one who's facilitating that, right? It's happening to you the way your heart is beating, right? The
Yeah,
thoughts
I guess
thoughts
this.
about the decision are just arising out of your unconscious, right? It's just all happening. You don't know why you end up thinking what you do or deciding what you do at the end of the day, right? It's just all a process. Does
Yeah,
that
but
make sense?
then like sort of. But then if it's all a process, I think this like actually comes back to my divide with, because it sounds like this is like I can just fit this right into materialism immediately. Like I don't really have to even modify anything. It's compatible with materialism. It seems like, but I still matter to me as a value judgment, and I guess I don't see how you actually get how something matters or doesn't matter. Like I can see from your opinion why, if I adopt this worldview and to truly adopt it and accept it and to experience it, I can agree why it would eliminate suffering, but it also seems like it would eliminate you know, essentially the entire emotional kind of, set of emotions, of which one is things that matter, and to say that it's important for this to happen, and that, because to say it matters is almost like I should do it or something. But yeah, does that make any sense?
Okay, yeah. So I misunderstood you initially. Yeah, I think that's back to that initial thing, is like, how do you ground
Sure.
this idea of value in something materialistic? I think what the Buddhists would want to say is that suffering is real, right? Suffering is, regardless of whether or not we have a self and regardless of whether or not we have free will,
Mhm.
the experience of suffering is still a real experience. Conscious creatures have the capacity to suffer,
Mhm.
and therefore it matters that we move away from that. Now, I'm anticipating that you would
Okay,
ask,
fine.
why does it matter that we move away from suffering, right? That's a fair question. And that's when you get into really tricky territory. But I think if we accept as an axiom that moving away from suffering is a good thing,
Okay, yeah,
and
this
moving
is now
towards
my
suffering,
this is
yeah,
my additional action. I'm saying, fine, sure. No, I agree. Sure,
yeah.
sure. Yeah, okay. Then fair enough. But then there's nothing you can do about it. It's like the suffering in the world is just going to be the way it is, and like that's that. No.
Not quite, because again, this idea of no self and no free will isn't fatalistic. It just means that there isn't ultimate, like there isn't this ultimate sense of libertarian freedom where we can kind of like pull things out of the ether and like create things out of nothing, basically, right? This like first mover kind of notion that doesn't
Okay.
actually make sense. I've never heard an account of libertarian free will that actually even makes sense on paper, let alone like in the real world.
Okay, what does that fully mean to say libertarian free will?
Libertarian free will is, I think, the sense that most of us have most of the time, which is that we could have done otherwise, right? Like if you rewound the universe back to the state that it was in 2 minutes ago when I decided to, have a chug of the water, I
Mm-hmm.
could have not, right? I could have not had that drink.
And
That's what
that's true for
libertarian,
any choice.
for any choice. There were essentially like competing metaphysical like options, and we like went down one road and not down the
Okay,
other.
yeah, that's absurd to me. Yeah,
No,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
It
yeah, sure,
doesn't, it does not map onto a
sure.
view of the world in the 21st century.
Yeah.
But it's still intuitively how we feel. Like that is how we feel most of the time. When we
Well,
make a
sort of,
decision.
except like, when I'm like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to be super productive and do all my homework, and, I might go to the gym and make nice meals and all this other stuff, and then tomorrow comes and I sleep in and I just play video games and drink beer all day and I don't do any of that. It's like, well, I almost didn't choose that because part of me that identified wanted to do this thing and I didn't. So then it's like, so what the
Right,
hell's going on there? And
but right. But there are a lot of this, like take a simple decision like walking into an ice cream shop and looking
Mhm.
at all the flavors and then being like, what do I want? Let me go for the, chocolate chip cookie dough. I think most of us doing that feel like if we went back to that decision point, we could have chosen something else, right? Like there was freedom there. Like we chose to get the chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream, whereas we could have gone for the like, mint chip. That's the intuitive feeling of moving through the world. And that's false. it's
Okay.
it's like it's an illusion. It's not actually true. It's just we feel it to be true.
Okay, I think I actually probably mostly agree with this, actually. Probably mostly agree with this. But then, like you said, I think you do need to stitch on another axiom, say why things matter. And yeah, and I think if we agree with that, then I think actually this idea is very compatible with my worldview, I would say. As long as you need to stitch on to materialism, something like minimizing suffering is bad. We ought not to do that. We ought not to induce additional suffering.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good. So yeah, so I guess I mean that was definitely kind of a detour about talking about meditation and psychedelics, but I think it was fruitful. So I guess we could jump into psychedelics, unless like is there something profound that you feel like this idea of meditation has provided you? Maybe we can you can summarize that and we can start talking about psychedelics for kind of the remainder of this.
Yeah. So absolutely. And I think a lot of what meditation provides is what we've already spoken about, which can sound almost trivial sometimes on paper, but experientially, it's completely revolutionary. It's a very different way of moving through the world, and the levels of well-being that are available there are enormous.
Sure.
Like it's a real treasure to be able to tap into that. And the reason, by the way, I never actually addressed your question from way at the beginning about why do so much of it. Like, why isn't meditation something that you kind of like, you get the experience, you go, you do your 7-day retreat, and then you're out.
Mhm.
And the reason is because it's a practice. It's not like it's not like you're going in to get your goodies and then you're going out.
Okay, sure. Sure.
It's like, think of it as going to the gym. It's something that you constantly need to work out, because our minds are conditioned to do the exact opposite. So it's like swimming against the stream of what our minds want to do, and therefore it requires a lot of constant facilitation, which is why people will meditate in the morning, they'll meditate in the evening, and they'll go on retreats. And it's kind of like a never-ending project, because you're trying to stabilize this. You're trying to make these insights more and more part of your everyday experience, right? You're trying to make it part of who you are, not something you experience once in a while, right? That's kind of the end goal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then kind of like the byproduct of this is this recognition of the fact that it's kind of like the stream of consciousness happens independent of your desire. Like I did meditation for a bit. Like I did Sam Harris's app, and I know at least in that there's certain exercises you do, and like one is return to the breath, and then if your mind wanders, just like identify and acknowledge the fact that your mind wandered, and then try to return to the breath. So I continuously like I can see how it's an exercise to return to the breath and to be present. But then it's like I realized like the thought is not what I control. Like that thought appeared in consciousness. It's not. I didn't make the thought go there. I intentionally, the part of me that I identify with, wanted the thought not to be there. But then I had no control over that. The thought just appeared in consciousness. Then I had to bring the attention back to myself. And yeah, and so the idea though, what you're saying is that like the recognition that you are not your thoughts are something that happens in consciousness. To fully realize that actually alleviates suffering, because suffering, a big part of what suffering is the attachment to the choices you make, and that you don't get the outcome that you want in some sense. And then so if you can detach from that, then and recognize that a kind of what's going to happen is going to happen, and you're just an observer in consciousness or something, like it will alleviate the suffering, because the suffering is caused by a mismatch between expectation and reality or something.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I would tweak about the way you just described it is that the suffering is born not only of a mismatch in terms of expectation and outcome, although that is a source of suffering, but it's more fundamentally it's the identification piece, right? It's the fact that we feel identified with certain parts of our experience and not with others, right? We feel very identified with our thoughts, to some extent with our bodies, although we'll feel identified more with certain parts of our bodies and not others, right? So there's not a lot of consistency, but we are very much identified with certain elements of our experience, and that identification leads to a lot of contraction and a lot of suffering around that, right? So the expectation versus reality thing is a piece of it, but it's not the full piece. It's really the identification piece that is at the core of the suffering on the Buddhist model, right?
What about if you identify with everything? You say there's parts of you that you don't identify with, and it's the identification part that's problematic. And I would agree with you that happens. And like I think there's a big part, for example, with addicts, is that it's kind of like I don't want to be an addict, but then there's something in me that is like, go do the drug, and then it's like I can't control that piece. But then, like in my conception at least, it's like to recognize that isn't an external thing, that is you, and that there's a desire that part of you is seeking, and then the goal is actually to find a healthy way to substitute a thing to satisfy that part of you's desire. So what I would say is actually, like I take this radical other view almost of everything in experience is you, and that there is no you and not you, and like it's almost like you only do what you want, period. And if there's a mismatch between what you think you want and what you do, it's because there's a part of you that you don't know. There's a part of you that you don't identify with, or something. And it seems like almost the exact opposite, but maybe that actually is aligned with this
No, I
idea.
think so. I love that you brought that up, and it's funny. I was listening to Alan Watts today. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's well-known kind of Eastern philosophy popularizer. Phenomenal speaker. Highly recommend his stuff. And a big part of his shtick is this idea of you are all of it. You are the entire show. Like he'll say things and he means it non-poetically. You are the Big Bang. Like he'll say that and he means that. He doesn't mean that in a poetic sense. He means that like actually you are this entire thing. And I think that is fully compatible with the Buddhist idea of no self. To me, the only difference there is the framing. And I think it's, yeah, because I don't see a difference between saying you're none of it or you're all of it. Like to me, that's just the two different ways of saying the exact same thing, which is that the fundamental thing that both of those things are saying is that this idea of separation, this idea that like I end where my skin is, or like I am this and not that, that's what's wrong. So whether or not you want to say that you're none of it or you want to say that you're all of it, to me is just a choice. I don't actually see. Yeah.
Okay, then I think I'm actually fully on board with this then. Yeah. Okay.
Again, just to emphasize, like the cash value of all of this is, does it lead to more freedom or less? Like that's really what matters, right?
Sure.
So it's not like an intellectual game, at least on the Buddhist, according to the Buddhist project, it's not just about figuring out the philosophy of this. It's like, does living this way bring more well-being, bring more freedom, bring more love, more compassion, right? Does it lead to those things or does it lead away from those things? And I think that the I am all of it freedom, I am all of it framing, or I am none of it framing can both lead to those things because they don't actually imply anything that different, at least on my account.
Yeah. It's essentially completely alleviated a judgment of myself as good or bad. Because it's like, I just am. I like it. And if I'm doing something, it's because there's a piece of me that I don't understand. It's not that, why didn't I do that? I'm a bad person or whatever. It's like that entire framing is now essentially blasted. So I think I agree. All right. So then one thing that to segue into psychedelics is you said that meditation, it's a practice. So you like do reps, but like I've definitely heard for a lot of people psychedelics, it's almost the exact opposite. It's kind of more like what I was saying, where it's like a lot of people, it's like, okay, I want to try DMT. I do it. I go see the space goblins, and then it's like I'm done. Like I did that exactly one time. Glad I experienced it. Don't want to do it again. And then, do you feel like psychedelics is a similar thing for you, or do you think that this is also kind of like a practice in some sense? I guess now, how would you differentiate, I guess, psychedelic use from say meditation?
Right. So it's interesting because my relationship to psychedelics has really shifted as a result of my meditation practice. So I started doing psychedelics before I started meditating. It's as I mentioned earlier, it's what got me interested in meditation because I was doing, going to raves and just doing acid with friends. I had no intention to get into anything like spiritual consciousness exploration. I was just wanting to have a good time, but I was doing a lot of acid and it does what it does. And it shows you very clearly that there are very different ways of experiencing the world and experiencing your consciousness. And that blew the doors open for me, and I couldn't look away, even though by constitution I'm very skeptical. I don't tend to gravitate towards those kind of things. But again, the beautiful thing about psychedelics is that you can be as skeptical as you want. If you pop 300 micrograms of acid, you're going to have an experience, and you can be like Richard Dawkins. It doesn't matter, right? So so then I started meditating, and coming back to psychedelics after having meditated, my relationship to psychedelics now is much more as like almost the way I relate to retreats, which it's a practice, but it's like turbocharged, right? It's like running a marathon versus like running a 5K, right? I don't view it as totally separate anymore. I don't view it as like a separate project. I view it as a way to go very deep, very fast, right? So it's like you're taking to like the express lane for however,
Dropped right in the deep end. Yeah, no, sure.
Right. but but it's fundamentally, to me, very much the same territory, which is exploring consciousness and navigating and trying to figure out what is true about my experience, moment to moment. And what's nice about psychedelics is that because it can be so intense and so powerful, right, you can come away with very unshakable understandings about things that are maybe not super available in, your day-to-day meditation, because things are more kind of ordinary. On the flip side, though, it's almost the opposite. There's the opposite danger, which is if you rely on psychedelics, you can start to associate spiritual or mystical states with all the fireworks, the pyrotechnics that are, that come along with psychedelics.
Sure.
Whereas again, meditation, the ultimate goal, as I spoke to earlier, is to move through the world in the most ordinary way with these understandings. It's to transform your experience of stubbing your fucking toe when you get up in the morning, right?
Sure.
So the psychedelic route has its own trap, because you can get attached to the fireworks and start to associate like altered states of consciousness or freedom with the psychedelic, right? Like you need the psychedelic in order to experience these things. Whereas I think what's really powerful about meditation is that the invitation is to bring this more and more into the most ordinary moments of day-to-day life. So I think that they are really, I personally, like, people have different opinions about this, but I view them as like very, very mutually supportive.
I see. And then, so the meditation practice, in some sense, no, because I can definitely understand the second part where it becomes like, attached. I think that's a good word to the psychedelic experience, because it can induce these mystical experiences that are just literally just like life changing. Like, there has been research in this, which is great. It's about time, and it's overwhelming. It's ridiculous. Like, I mean, now it's like a lot of these psychedelics are being rushed through FDA approval for treatment-resistant depression, and they've had insane success rates. It's like SSRIs for depression, in the best case, has like a 20% efficacy, and then it's something like if someone takes a psychedelic and has a mystical experience, it's like 80% success rate to cure these things. So it's absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, and I guess, like, okay, one thing I am definitely curious about is mystical experience. Is this something that you feel like you've experienced, or that you and how do you make sense of what's going on there with the mystical experience? Because, like, a common theme that people say is something like, whether it's not always just actually an encounter with God. It's some people have these experiences and they say, like, oh, like, I came back from this and it was like I knew God was real. And then other people have these experiences and say, come back for it, I knew God wasn't real and it was great. And so it's not like, it's almost like metaphysically there's not a like direct link of what it actually is telling you, but then there is commonalities, and people come out of it almost saying, like, whatever that was is more real than this. And it's like there's something about the experience that you have when you do this that is more real. And then, so I've had definitely an experience like this, and this is the experience I had when I feel like, God talked to me. And it was just insane. It was overwhelming, and it was like, whatever that is more real. And then a large part of, like, since that happened, is how do I get back to this state? How do I find a way to access this state in my everyday life? Because it was like I was invincible. It was like I always knew exactly what to do. I didn't fight myself ever. I was totally aligned, and I just did what I needed to do, and it worked, and it was just like magnificent, because it lasted for a while. It wasn't like I just had this and came down. It was like I had this experience, and then for like a month, just like everything was just, it was insane how just like in touch with reality I felt. I just felt like I was one with reality or something. And it was like, I don't know. I don't know if any of this is resonating or not, but
yeah. So I mean, I think that I've certainly had what I would call mystical experiences, and I think a lot of them come back to some of the stuff we spoke about with regards to meditation. I think one of the common components when people talk about having mystical experiences is feeling this profound sense of oneness with everything, right? There's no separation there. And psychedelics can reliably induce this, right? Where like everything dissolves. I am just all of it, right? And again, that's back to the point of like no self. There is no separate me. It's all just consciousness. It's all just consciousness. And a
Interesting.
lot of times what's associated with that is a profound sense of love and gratitude. There's a lot of like really beautiful emotions that come along with that experience. So yeah, that's something that I have tasted, and that's what got me interested in meditation to begin with. And I've now tasted very similar states through meditation alone. Like if you go on a long meditation retreat, you can find yourself in states that feel very similar to psychedelic states without doing the psychedelics, right? Because to me, all of this is just the potential within consciousness, right? It's the potential that we all carry around with us that we usually don't tap into. But something like psychedelics, something like meditation, just is like tuning the dial towards this possibility. That being said, I do think it's important. I think we spoke about this at some point, that I think it's important to not make metaphysical claims based on mystical or psychedelic experiences. And this is something that I see happen a lot, which is, someone will do acid, have an experience of Jesus or Muhammad or whatever framework they happen to be in, and then come out of that experience saying, well, that felt pretty fucking real. So, that must be that's it. That's the truth, right? And I think that's a misstep. That's unwarranted, because something can feel very real. It doesn't mean that it's actually, ontologically in the real world real. It was real experientially.
No, sure. Yeah, I know this is definitely, this definition of real is one that I seem to disagree a lot with people about, because like to me, I think I know what you mean though, and I we don't have to fight on this one a lot, because, and I think it's well put to say it's not, and I think I would agree with you that it's not wise to come from this and make metaphysical claims, but then phenomenologically, I think there is a notion of reality that you can say, and that it's like the phenomenological description I think can be valid, but then but there is a difference between like phenomenological ontology and an actual true metaphysical claim. And and I think at least that part I think I would disagree with, because like in some sense I would almost say it's real that they had an encounter with Jesus. Like, to me that's real.
Yeah.
But then that doesn't necessarily say anything metaphysically about the world and about the role that Jesus plays in the world.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with any of that.
Yeah.
I think the experience is real, and as you point out, those experiences oftentimes feel more real than our ordinary kind of waking consciousness. That's all true. But I think what's tempting to do then, and a lot of people do this, is they then make actual metaphysical claims on the basis of those experiences. And I think that's fundamentally like that's not intellectually rigorous, and it's also doesn't actually make sense, because people will have mutually exclusive experiences on psychedelics. So if they both implied that they're metaphysically true, we would get two pictures of metaphysics that are at odds with one another. So like that can't actually work out. And one last point on this. I actually don't think that it's important to go metaphysical with these things. Like I don't think a lot is lost if we don't take that route. So I'll give you an example from my own experience. I did ayahuasca for the first time in Peru like 5 years ago. And I had, on my third ceremony on this ayahuasca retreat, I had like a really profound experience where I felt like I was in dialogue with this ayahuasca spirit. It was the most powerful experience I've ever had of being in dialogue with something that is other than me. It was wild, completely wild. And it was beautiful, and it was healing, and it was amazing. I came out of that and I was like, okay, I see why someone who had that experience would absolutely conclude that there is a spirit out there called ayahuasca. I got a glimpse into why that would be a tempting thing to do. But I didn't feel the need to do that, because to me, nothing was lost about my experience by not then making the claim that there is an actual spirit out there. Like I was comfortable leaving it at, this was a very real experience that changed me in certain ways, that stayed with me, that moved me. And I don't need to make any additional claims about it, right? So I think it's not actually important. It's not like, it doesn't add much to the picture to me if I were to conclude that there's like an actual spirit out there. I think all that would be is essentially intellectually not rigorous, and it wouldn't be contributing to the experience in any way, right? It would be like tacked on. It would be tacked on at the end.
Yeah, it's funny because I know when we actually talked about this not too long ago, and it's funny because I actually don't disagree with you at all. Yeah, and I think the key distinction actually is metaphysics. Like to say that that's metaphysically true. But then like in some sense, I don't think you can actually prove anything metaphysically. Like I think metaphysical realities will essentially always be unknown to us. So to me, it's kind of like trying to assert a metaphysical claim is just like it's almost not even useful. It's like, how would you ever verify such a thing? Like, so it's kind of like, okay, but then phenomenologically, I would say that that's a data point. I cannot throw that data point away. Like if I were to have a model that were describe being, it needs to include that experience. And so like, that's what I mean when I say everything's real, is that it needs to be, you can't just reject it. I can't just take someone that's schizophrenic and not have a model that explains that in some sense, whatever they experience. And so I have to take it real in that sense, in that it's a real experience that occurs, and that whatever model I conceptualize of being has to account for that if it were to be a complete model. And so it's real in that sense. But yeah, I would agree with you. Like, I think I have a better idea of metaphysics now, and I would almost say like making legitimate metaphysical claims is, yeah, I agree. Like, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, like I almost would say that like it's just spinning your wheels in the mud to try to make metaphysical claims. I think I don't know. I don't even know how you would ever invalidate or support a metaphysical model.
Yeah. So I don't know if I do think that it's warranted to make metaphysical claims, generally speaking, although I know it is fraught territory. But all I'm saying, I think I'm making a more limited claim than you. I'm saying that it's not warranted to make metaphysical claims on the basis of experience alone, right? Like personal experiences that we have, like psychedelic experiences. I'm not saying that the entire project of metaphysics is doomed.
Okay, yeah.
But
my tone said that. I want to correct that. Yeah, I agree with the way you said it. Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but I just want to reiterate the point you just made, which is that I fully agree with, and I think it's an important point, is that those are all data points that are important. And this is something that really frustrates me on the materialist kind of scientific side of the aisle, which is, this is kind of like the map that I have. You have the people who are like being way too sloppy with concepts and with their metaphysical view of the world on the basis of experiences. That's like the whole, what I would consider the religious side of things, which is like, you have an experience and you didn't like build entire towers on the basis of that.
Sure, right? Man. Sure.
And then on the other side of the aisle, you have the scientific, like hardhead types, which are like, it's like all data, it's all third person.
Richard Dawkins, yeah, sure. Yeah.
And the problem is if you commit to that, there's a lot of uncomfortable data that comes in that you just don't really know how to incorporate. So what you end up doing is you just like, just not gonna, not going to acknowledge that. Like, that's just not going to be a thing.
Yeah.
And to me, there's a middle ground to be had there.
Yes. Yeah.
And there are very few people that I'm aware of that occupy that space. But you mentioned Sam Harris earlier. To me, he's like a perfect example of someone who toes that line, I think, in a really nice way, where on the one hand, he's not tempted by a lot of the, like, frankly, BS stories that a lot of the religions have at their core, but he's also very aware of the deeper elements that these religions have at their core, that he thinks we should maintain, that he thinks we should salvage. Right.
Great. Yeah,
and I think like that's the project.
I agree. Great. 100%. Yeah. I feel like Jordan Peterson's there. Yeah, I think he's a little more on the religion side, but he's definitely not religious. Like, if you sit him down, put a gun to his head, like, he's not convinced to say I'm a Christian, and it, like, it seems really hard to get him to actually say that. fair enough, But and then John Vervaeke, there's a few other people that I've been talking a lot about on my channel because I agree, and I would say almost the point of this channel is to find that middle ground because I think both of these extremes are not only problematic but wrong, and that and yeah, like I'm not a big fan of the fundamentalists on the religious side, I guess, or the materialist side. I don't like this idea, and I think that there's a dialogue to be had between like the potency of materialism, and it's excellent at what it does. I just think that there's more to experience than can be explained by materialism and by this worldview that, in some sense, it almost rejects your experience. It rejects human experience. It's like, have you forgotten that you're a human? It's like, yeah. And
no, that's it's funny because we're talking about this in one of my classes now in philosophy of mind. This is such a poignant example of what happens if you go down this road and you just get lost. There is an actual philosophical position called Illusionism, which to me is the epitome of ridiculousness in philosophy, which is the position is that consciousness is an illusion. That is
what?
Yes, yeah.
What?
And this is not some fringe thing. This is
I don't even get that. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It's absolutely like it's unbelievable. I've read papers on this. Like there's no
And that doesn't make
it doesn't make any
What?
sense. But the reason it arises, and it's to our point, the reason it arises is because we can't explain consciousness in material terms, right? So there's a real temptation there to just get rid of the problem, which is to say that it's not there to begin with. Problem solved, right? So that's
oh man, this is so wild because like part of me actually thinks that that's the path we're on. Like it's honestly like there's this really weird. You can almost interpret a cycle. I know you got to run, so we can wrap this up soon. But it's almost like there's a desire to remove consciousness. It's like actually the goal in some sense of you ask what is this pathway we're on with materialism. It's almost like there's actually almost like the suicidal desire to remove consciousness because it's so unbearable or something. Like to remove consciousness. I mean, like it's like if there's this really just bizarre case because I feel like the modern materialist view really like tries to just reject human experience and rejects that you're an observer and you cannot take the materialist worldview and turn it back on itself. And like we don't know how to do that. And we don't know how to understand experience itself. And it's like to even get science off the ground, you have to be a conscious agent. And then the best part about quantum mechanics is that's in the theory now. And it's kind of like, and then as a physicist, I know this, they sweep that under the rug. And if you ask people about that, you ask physicists about that, like, oh, like how do you interpret quantum mechanics and the fact that there's an observer that needs to, collapse the wave function or whatever, like they get like frustrated, And it's like, oh, that's philosophy. We don't talk about that. It's like, well, how do you reconcile that with the rest of this, Like, it means the subject and the object you cannot separate them. And, like, this subjective world is, like, to me, I don't know, there's a lot of color there. And to me, it's like, I define that as religion, and I get that it's, fair enough. But, like, there's something to that I just think materialism cannot explain. And, like, I'm kind of on this quest to better understand that part.
But no, I think that's right. Like the consciousness is a massive elephant in the room for the scientific project, and then you have people who take it to the extreme and just want to delete the whole thing. Which all I want to say to an illusionist, if I ever get to be in a room with one, is like, aren't you experiencing something right now? Like I just want to ask that simple question. Like, do you not have an experience of espousing your philosophical view, right? Like it's a non-starter to me.
Oh, it makes
and by
no
the
sense.
way, it doesn't make any sense.
Like you have to be aware of the illusion.
Right, exactly. It's the one thing that Sam Harris says this, and I fully agree with him. He says, consciousness is literally the only thing in the world that cannot be an illusion. Like you could make arguments for everything else being an illusion.
Yeah.
But even if you were having a fully illusory experience, the experience itself would be real, as you say, right? Like there's no way that the experience itself, in terms of like the fact that there's something that it's like to be you, can be illusory because it's just there. And by the way, this is to me where I think the term, I don't love this term because I think it's oftentimes flung around, especially by religious folk, in a way that I don't think is fair. But I think this is somewhere where I would use the term scientism, right? I think it's appropriate here.
Sure.
Where to me, scientism is when you're so committed to the scientific worldview that you discount anything that doesn't fit into that model. And that to me is like, it's literally the religious worldview, just using science instead. It's the same.
It's the
mechanism.
dogmatic element.
The
Yeah.
dogmatic element.
Yes,
Right.
yes,
That's what I
yes.
mean. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And yeah, like and I want to put this on the record book. When I say religious, like, it's something different than dogma. And I do not. There's actually something about dogma that you need to believe in some system to even go. But to set anything as never to be questioned, I'm not a fan of that. Everything is questionable, But yeah, so I don't know. I think that's probably a pretty good conversation. Is there anything you want to end on? Anything else you'd like to say, or want to give a shout out to, if you want to start a YouTube channel or something? I don't know.
No, I think the only thing I'd say is thanks for this conversation. It was a lot of fun. I love these topics, and I probably butchered a lot of it. But I will say I'll actually plug. I think if anyone's interested in getting into this stuff, Sam Harris, who we've mentioned a few times, I think is really the go-to person. And in particular, he has a book called Waking Up.
Mm-hmm.
And the subtitle, which you might not like, Nick, but still, I think it's a good book, which is A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like where he lays out this whole case of basically what we just spoke about. How can you kind of like salvage and maintain a lot of the deeper, more beautiful elements that these religious traditions have at their core, without needing to ascribe to all of the other stuff, the baggage, right? And he does it's a relatively short book, and he's phenomenal. So Waking Up by Sam Harris is my recommendation.
Okay, just real quick on the title of that book. If the word religion was replaced with dogma, you think it would be the same thing?
Yeah, I think Sam uses religion as synonymous with dogma, and you would bicker with that. But I don't think it's an actual like fundamental. Yeah.
All right. Awesome, great. Well, let's do it again. This is one thing I miss about not living with you anymore. Like the conversation's always great, so good to do it again. Yeah. And then and to YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to stay up to date. And until next time, take care.
All right, peace.